I spent 15 years believing I had a stress problem. My blood tests eventually told me I had a metabolic one. The stress had mostly gone. The body hadn't got the memo. I was sleeping better, things were calmer, and something was still running in the background that I couldn't explain. An inflammation pattern that kept showing up in the data long after the obvious causes had cleared. And cortisol was the thing connecting all of it. I'm Neil, 13 years of NHS blood tests, off all medication since February 2024. My CRP, that's the inflammation marker in a standard blood panel, dropped 84% in 3 months. Not because I managed my stress better, because something downstream had changed. And the mechanism that explains it is relevant to anybody whose body feels like it's running on a setting it can't switch off, whatever the reason. First, why cortisol stays elevated after stress has passed, and what's actually keeping the alarm running. Then the CRP data, what my inflammation numbers looked like over 13 years and what it took for them to move. And then day 24 of an extended fast, a very specific moment that told me something had physically reversed. The conventional framing around cortisol is this: cortisol is your stress hormone, and if you're experiencing the effects of elevated cortisol, inflammation, weight retention, around the middle, disrupted sleep, low energy, the answer is to reduce your stress. And that makes complete sense on the surface. The mechanism is real. Stress triggers cortisol. Cortisol, sustained, causes problems. So reduce the stressor, cortisol drops, body recovers. The NHS guidance, every lifestyle article you've ever read, the advice you get at a routine GP check-in, it all flows from that model. Manage your stress, try mindfulness, exercise, take breaks. And none of that is wrong. Exactly. Robert Sapolsky, neurobiologist at Stanford, spent decades studying stress hormones across primates and humans and made a point that reframed this for me. He put it simply: our stress response was built for brief, intense physical threats. 3 minutes of danger, then rest. Modern psychological stress runs the same hormonal system, but it runs it continuously. The system wasn't designed for that, and when it runs continuously for years, something shifts. I believed I had a stress problem for most of my 40s. What I actually had was a metabolic system that had been running at high alert for so long, it had lost the ability to stand down. And by the time I was trying to fix it, the stress, the original trigger, had actually reduced considerably. The body was just still going. Let me give you the context, because it matters. From roughly 2003 to 2019, I ran a kitchen installation sales business. 18 years, the kind of stress that is genuinely something. Cash flow, staff, sales pressure, 80-hour weeks quite often, real, sustained, operational pressure that I now recognise looking back. I had no real tools to manage. During that period, and I wish I'd known then what I know now, my blood picture was deteriorating quietly. Not dramatically, not in ways anyone flagged. My HbA1c was 38 in 2015, 40 in 2016, 43 by 2020. Cholesterol climbing, gout flares, all the markers were moving in the wrong direction year on year, while I was being told the results were fine. I wasn't eating terribly by the standard understanding at the time. Cooked meals, home food, nothing dramatic. I actually thought Subway was a reasonable lunch. I know better now. It wasn't alcohol, it wasn't takeaways. It was just wrong fuel, too much of it, wrong timing, zero understanding of what was happening metabolically. And then something interesting happened around 2020. I moved away from the business, genuinely less pressure. Not no pressure. We were leaner financially, but the grinding operational stress of running a sales team, the 80-hour weeks, the relentless commercial anxiety, gone, or significantly reduced at least. My body didn't notice. By December 2023, HbA1c at 46, 1 point from a diabetes diagnosis. Cholesterol 8, the highest it had ever been. My CRP, the inflammation marker, sitting at levels that were technically within range, but that I now understand to mean the alarm was still running. The stress trigger had largely cleared, but the system, it had wound up. The metabolic machinery that had been operating in emergency mode for 20 years was still running exactly as before, because it had learned to run that way, and cortisol wasn't the cause of the inflammation anymore. It was one mechanism in a chain that had become self-sustaining. Boxing Day 2023, that was the moment I decided something had to actually change. I started with a 10-day water-only fast, and then I started time-restricted eating. Proper whole food. not healthy-ish supermarket food, actual whole food. And from January 2024 through into January 2025, a series of extended fasts. Over the 3-4 years after the business, I'd moved GPs a couple of times, and my new GP wasn't particularly engaged with the journey. My data was fine. Off the problem list was probably more accurate by 2024 end of, but I was monitoring everything and my old records were mine. What changed wasn't stress management. I didn't start meditating. I didn't take up yoga. Didn't book a holiday. I changed what I was eating, when I was eating, and I gave my metabolic system the extended periods of nutrient absence it needed to reset. In January 2025, I started resistance training alongside a 10-day water fast. The combination, I can't isolate which lever pulled what, but the data in the following 3 months was the clearest signal I'd seen in 13 years. January 2025, CRP 6.2, upper end of normal, inflammation marker sitting where it had been sitting for years. Technically fine, nobody was particularly concerned. April 25, CRP was 1. That's an 84% reduction in 90 days. Same panel, Calprotectin, the gut-specific inflammation marker, not on a standard NHS panel. I did it privately, came back essentially 0. My liver enzyme, dropped to the lowest reading in 13 years of records. 3 markers converging simultaneously, all of them suggesting the same thing. The alarm had finally started to quiet. And here's what I want to be clear about. This happened after the stress had already reduced. This happened after I was sleeping better. This happened 3-4 years after the operational pressure that I used to think was causing the problem had pretty much gone away. The thing that moved these markers wasn't managing my stress better. It was changing the metabolic environment that had been keeping my cortisol system chronically activated, specifically through the gut, because that, it turned out, was where the self-sustaining part of the inflammation loop was living. I want to tell you about day 24 of an extended fast last summer. It was day 3 of a retreat, and this was the moment that made the mechanism concrete for me. I'd been fasting for 3 weeks at that point. I was then day 3 of a refeed, and I looked at my foot, my big toe specifically, and noticed something was missing. I'd had a growth there for years, 20 plus years, a lump of crystallized uric acid, visible, inflamed, and it was the residue of 24 years of gout. During previous fasts, the colour had been slowly dying down, but this time it had gone. Not reduced, gone, absorbed, like my body had finally had the cellular downtime to deal with it properly. I hadn't consciously noticed it disappearing. 3 days after the fast ended, I looked down and it wasn't there. That was the moment I understood that the metabolic system doesn't run on the same clock as your stress levels. The stress had been lower for 3 years. The body needed a fundamentally different input to actually reset the alarm. My GP has started looking forward to my blood tests almost as much as I do, which probably says something about the state of the NHS, but also about what's possible when you actually change the inputs. 13 years of data, all of it documented here. Subscribe if you want to follow. What my data suggests, and it's one person's data, 13 years, one body, is that cortisol dysregulation and chronic inflammation are often downstream of a metabolic problem, not a stress problem. And if the metabolic problem is what's sustaining the alarm, then stress management alone won't quiet it. In my case, the stress had reduced considerably before the inflammation markers moved at all. They only moved when I changed the metabolic inputs, food quality, eating timing, extended fasting, resistance training. That's what the data shows for me, n equals 1. To be clear, stress management matters. Managing chronic stress absolutely reduces cortisol. If you're in an acutely stressful situation, demanding job, difficult circumstances, ongoing pressure, addressing that is real and important. Breathwork, sleep, reducing stimulant load, managing what you can manage, none of that is wrong. And if someone is genuinely acute stress state, the conversation about metabolic health still needs to start with sort the stress first, because you can't sustain the dietary and lifestyle changes while the alarm is triggering constantly. These aren't competing, they're sequential. The mechanism here is worth understanding before any of this shows up on a blood test. What my data suggests is that the cortisol to inflammation loop often gets established during high stress periods and then runs on its own metabolic momentum for years afterwards. The stress passes, the system is set up, doesn't automatically stand down. That's relevant for anyone who's been through a high pressure period, professionally, personally, whatever it was, and notices that things still feel like they're running at a setting they just can't quite identify. The mechanism, it tends to show up in the data years before it gets a name. And what my 13-year picture suggests is that the earlier you change the inputs, the less distance the system has to travel back. If you're on medication for anything related to inflammation, blood pressure, blood sugar, or metabolic health, this is not a reason to change anything unilaterally. The conversation I'm describing is one to have with your GP, not instead of. If this is useful and you want to go deeper, the gut inflammation mechanism, the information that produced the CRP drop, the Calprotectin picture, there's a full Friday deep dive in the link below that covers the whole data. That's where the detail lives. Links in the description. This is educational content only. It's not medical advice. Never stop or change medication without your GP's supervision.